Hi everyone, Mrs. McKirgan here, coming to you live from my living room. I'm going to read you a story today about this bear here. You've probably seen him before. Does anybody know his name? It's Paddington. Okay, the Paddington stories are actually on the Year 4 star reading list. This book here, A Bear Called Paddington, is on the Year 4 list for the star readers. I'm going to read you a slightly different version today that I've already got at home because it's got some nice pictures for you to look at as well. Okay. So let's begin with the story of Paddington. Mr. and Mrs. Brown first met Paddington on a railway platform. In fact, that was how he came to have such an unusual name for a bear, because Paddington was the name of the station. The Browns were waiting to meet their daughter Judy when Mr. Brown noticed something small and furry near the left luggage office. "It looks like a bear," he said. "A bear?" repeated Mrs. Brown. "On Paddington Station? Don't be silly, Henry. There can't be." There they are. Look, there's Mr. and Mrs. Brown in a very busy station in London called Paddington Station. There he is. But Mr. Brown was right. It was sitting on an old leather suitcase marked "Wanted on Voyage." And as they drew near it stood up and politely raised its hat. "Good afternoon," it said. "May I help you?" "It's very kind of you," said Mr. Brown, "but as a matter of fact, we were wondering if we could help you." "You're a very small bear," said Mrs. Brown. "Where are you from?" The bear looked around carefully before replying. "Darkest Peru. I'm not really supposed to be here at all. I'm a stowaway." Okay, there's Paddington talking to Mr. and Mrs. Brown. A stowaway, that means he's travelled from Peru all the way to London, and he shouldn't really have been travelling. I'm not sure how he would have travelled from Peru to London. Maybe that's something that you could try and find out. Maybe on a boat, on an aeroplane. "You don't mean to say you've come all the way from South America on your own?" exclaimed Mrs. Brown. "Whatever did you do for food?" Unlocking the suitcase, the bear took out an almost empty glass jar. I ate marmalade," it said. "Bears like marmalade." Mrs. Brown looked at the label around the bear's neck. It said quite simply, there it is, "Please look after this bear. Thank you." "Oh, Henry," she cried, "we can't leave him here all by himself. There's no knowing what might happen to him. Can't he come home and stay with us?" "Stay with us?" repeated Mr. Brown nervously. I'm not so sure that he wants to take this bear home with him. He looked down at the bear. Would you like that?" he asked. "That is," he added hastily, "if you've nothing else planned." "Oh yes," replied the bear, "I would like that very much. I've nowhere to go and everyone seems in such a hurry." There they are talking. "That settles it," says Mrs. Brown. "Now you must be thirsty after your journey. Mr. Brown, can you get some tea while I go and meet our daughter Judy?" "But Mary," said Mr. Brown, "we don't even know its name." Mrs. Brown thought for a moment. I know," she said. "We'll call him Paddington, after the station." Paddington. The bear tested it several times to make sure. It sounds very important. Mr. Brown tried it out next. "Follow me, Paddington, and I'll take you to the snack bar." Off they go. Mr. Brown and Paddington off to find a snack. Mr. Brown was as good as his word. Paddington had never seen so many snacks on one tray, and he didn't know which to try first. He was so hungry and thirsty, he climbed upon the table to get a better look. Mr. Brown turned away, pretending he had tea with a bear on Paddington Station every day of his life. There he is, there's Paddington sat on the table so that he gets a good look view around the cafe. "Henry," cried Mrs. Brown when she arrived with Judy, "what are you doing to that poor bear?" Paddington jumped up to raise his hat, and in his haste he trod on a strawberry tart, skidded on the cream and fell over backwards into his cup of tea. Oh dear. What a mess he's made. And this little girl here is Judy. That's Mr. and Mrs. Brown's little girl. "I think we better go before anything else happens," said Mr. Brown. Judy took hold of Paddington's paw. "Come along," she said. "We'll take you home and you can meet Mrs. Bird and my brother Jonathan." Mr. Brown led the way to a waiting taxi. "Number 32 Windsor Gardens, please," he said. The driver stared at Paddington. "Bears is extra," he growled. "Sticky Bears is twice as much. And make sure none of it comes off in my interior. It was clean when I set out this morning." Doesn't seem like a very friendly taxi driver, does he? The sun was shining as they drove out of the station, and there were cars and big red buses everywhere. Paddington waved at some people waiting at a bus stop, and several of them waved back. It was all very friendly. There he is, leaning out of the window. Paddington tapped the taxi driver on his shoulder. "It isn't a bit like darkest Peru," he announced. The man jumped at the sound of Paddington's voice. "Cream," he said bitterly. "Cream and jam all over me coat." He slid the little window shut behind him. "Oh dear, Henry," murmured Mrs. Brown. "I wondered if we're doing the right thing." I think they're already wondering whether they did the right thing bringing Paddington home to their house. Fortunately, before anyone had time to answer, they arrived at Windsor Gardens and Judy helped Paddington onto the pavement. "Now you're going to meet Mrs. Bird," she said. "She looks after us. She's a bit fierce at times, but she doesn't really mean it. I'm sure you'll like her." Paddington felt his knees begin to wobble. "I'm sure I shall if you say so," he replied. "The thing is, will she like me?" There they are, look, arriving at number 32 Windsor Gardens, where the Browns live. And can you see, looking out of the window, there's Jonathan, their little boy, and there's Mrs. Bird. Now, Mrs. Bird is the housekeeper who lives with the Brown family. This book is quite an old book, and a housekeeper would be a sort of servant who would live in the house, help keep the house clean, help look after the children, do the cooking, that sort of thing for the family. "Goodness gracious," exclaimed Mrs. Bird. "What have you got there?" "It's not a what," said Judy. "It's a bear called Paddington, and he's coming to stay with us." "A bear?" said Mrs. Bird as Paddington raised his hat. "Well, he has good manners, I'll say that for him." "I'm afraid I stepped on a jam tart by mistake," said Paddington. "I can see that," said Mrs. Bird. "You'd better have a bath before you're very much older. Judy can turn it on for you. I dare say you'll be wanting some marmalade too." "I think she likes you," whispered Judy. Look at this mess. Oh, look at him all covered in mess. Paddington had never been in a bathroom before, and while the water was running, he made himself at home. First of all, he tried writing his new name in the steam on the mirror. Then he used Mr. Brown's shaving foam to draw a map of Peru on the floor. It wasn't till a drip landed on his head that he remembered what he was supposed to be doing. He soon discovered that getting into a bath is one thing, but it's quite another matter getting out again, especially when it's full of soapy water. Oh dear, can you see Paddington in the bath with all the water overflowing? Paddington tried calling out, "Help!" At first in a quiet voice so as not to disturb anyone, then very loudly, "Help! Help!" When that didn't work, he began bailing the water out with his hat. But the hat had several holes in it, and his map of Peru soon turned into a sea of foam. Suddenly, Jonathan and Judy burst into the bathroom and lifted a dripping Paddington onto the floor. "Thank goodness you're all right," cried Judy. "We heard you calling out." "Fancy making such a mess," said Jonathan admiringly. "You should have pulled the plug out." "Oh," said Paddington, "I never thought of that. Look at that bathroom. Floor is covered in water. There's mess everywhere." When Paddington came downstairs, he looked so clean no one could possibly be cross at him. His fur was all soft and silky, his nose gleamed, and his paws had lost all traces of the jam and cream. The Browns made room for him in a small armchair, and Mrs. Bird brought him a pot of tea and a plate of hot buttered toast and marmalade. There he is, sat in a chair, eating his favourite marmalade. "Now," said Mrs. Brown, "you must tell us all about yourself. I'm sure you must have had lots of adventures." "I have," said Paddington earnestly. "Things are always happening to me. I'm that sort of bear." He settled back in the armchair. "I was brought up by my Aunt Lucy in darkest Peru," he began, "but she had to go into a home for retired bears in Lima." He closed his eyes thoughtfully, and a hush fell over the room as everyone waited expectantly. There's the family look, all waiting to hear what Paddington's got to say. After a while, when nothing happened, they began to get restless. Mr. Brown tried coughing. Then he reached across and poked Paddington. "Well, I never," he said. "I do believe he's fast asleep." "After all that's happened to him," said Mrs. Brown, "is it any wonder?" And there he is, fast asleep in his armchair after his adventures. So that's the end of the very first story of Paddington Bear. There's a few more stories in this book. There's lots and lots of stories that the author, Michael Bond, has written about Paddington that you might like to look up as well. Hope you enjoyed the story. And if you'd like me to read any more, just let me know. Send me a message on Dojo and we can read some of the stories in the book. Okay.